Hey guys, it's the Strega Mystica, John Michael Salvato. What's the difference between Italian folk magic, Catholic folk magic, Italian American folk magic, and the old religions of Italy, Sicily, Greece, and Rome? Well, buckle up, fam, because shit's about to get real. Those who don't know me know that I'm not one to, as we say, parlutisci. I don't find any value in speaking in a pretentious manner. Maybe because I'm neurodivergent, or maybe because I just don't have time for bullshit in my life. As a genderqueer esotericist, author, healer, and teacher whose doctoral degree in theological anthropology informs but doesn't dictate my spiritual practice, I don't have any use for creating drama or hurting people's feelings. I don't see any value in that. But I also feel compelled to maintain my Franciscan vows to speak truth in the face of falsity, to set right that which is unjustly maligned, and to do so out of a compassion, because there are people out there who are teaching things that are untrue. So, and that's the reason I recently commented on videos of 3 different practitioners who self-identify as Italian American folk witches or Italian American folk magic practitioners, to help set the record straight about some misinformation they were promulgating on their social media content. Now, as a neurodivergent person, I don't understand why someone would take offense to someone giving them the facts when they're mistaken. People correct me all the time, and I'm grateful for it. And to be fair, I'm not saying that all 3 of those people that I shared the actual truth with and the facts with took offense to it. But some of the people that watch their pages do. And so let's start there. As I said, each of these people self-identify as Italian American folk witches or folk magic practitioners. So that should be accepted as being exactly who they are at face value. If they're of Italian descent and living in the Americas, then they are Italian American, period. If their spiritual practice is influenced in any way by their family's culture, they have every right to call themselves whatever they wish, including Italian American folk witches or folk magic practitioners, if that's what their family practice and if that's how they identify. We have no right to police people's identities. Maybe their families didn't practice in recent generations. Maybe they took it upon themselves to learn from others who identify as Italian or Afro-Sicilian folk magic practitioners. They still have every right to determine how they identify, and I will defend that till the end of time. And because Italian and Afro-Sicilian folk magic are not a codified or homogenized practice like most of the 20th century iterations of neo-pagan witchcraft or pop culture witchcraft, then nobody has a right to say that their way is the only authentic way, because no such thing exists. I teach authentic Afro-Sicilian and Southern Italian, which after all is historically Afro-Sicilian folk magic, but so do people whose practices look nothing like mine, and their practice is authentic as well. And again, I will defend people's right to that. This is, however, something I won't ignore. And that's those who misrepresent factual, documented history, cultural origin, anthropology, and research by making spurious and inaccurate claims that simply aren't true. So, more on that, non mi riri e sebiri. We'll put a pin in that. We'll talk about that in a minute. So let's first unpack a few things that I think lie at the heart of those misrepresentations that we're seeing far too often in our culture and on social media today. Far too often on TikTok and Instagram and YouTube videos. So I want to unpack those misrepresentations. First, Southern Italian and Afro-Sicilian folk magic is not the same as Catholic folk magic. It never has been, and it never will be. That's why at the Inner Alchemy Mystery School, instructors like Michael Therese McQueen teaches the course on Catholic folk magic, while I teach courses on Stregoneria, Fatocchieria, chaos magic, because Afro-Sicilian and Southern Italian folk magic is a worldview. It's not a religion. It never has been a religion. It existed long before the church and separate and distinct from forms of so-called Italian Catholic folk magic began in the 12th and 13th centuries of the Common Era. Now, we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. Since that time, there has also been an undeniable intersectionality between those two practices. So let's first rewind and talk about Afro-Sicilian and Southern Italian folk magic and its distinction from what we now refer to as paganism, something that often gets either glossed over or ignored. Paganism is a term that was initially used pejoratively by the Roman Catholic Church and the Roman Empire to refer to anyone who is not Catholic. It derives from the Latin word paganus, which is a word for civilian. And so from the Catholic Church's perspective, warped as it was, they saw themselves as the soldiers of Christ, which is so freaking cringe. But those who were not soldiers of Christ, i.e. those who were not Catholic, were considered civilians and they would look down upon them. It makes absolutely no sense. So if you're confused by that, you rightly should be, because why would you want to have soldiers if there wasn't anyone to defend, if there weren't civilians? But that's a topic for another day. In modern parlance, however, when we say pagan, we're referring to those who worship various deities in Etruscan, Norman, Roman, Greek, Persian, Phoenician, Minoan, African, and Middle Eastern religious pantheons outside the Judeo-Christian tradition. So if you prayed to, worshipped, or served anyone other than the mythological Yahweh of the oppressive patriarchal Abrahamic religions, you're considered pagan. You were considered pagan by the church. Never forget that. We never identify, those who were outside, our ancestors would have never identified as pagan if they were non-Catholic. And you go back far enough, and every one of our ancestors, even if you were raised Catholic, even if you're generationally, 10th generation Catholic, your family at some point would not have been Catholic, because Catholicism wouldn't have existed, and we would have never called ourselves pagan. Religion is something we need to define and understand for the purposes of this dialogue. Religion could be understood in this case as a range of social cultural systems, including designated behaviors, practices, morals, beliefs, sanctified places, prophecies, and organizations or texts that generally encourage humanity to worship supernatural, transcendental, and spiritual beings. It informs and it inspires the development of societal worldviews, ethics, and in many cases and many cultures, the legal codes of the day, by stark contrast to the earliest legal codes, which were devoid of religious influence some 3,700 years ago, things like the Code of Hammurabi. Therefore, for example, the religious gatherings that are said to have been held in Tuscany at Lake Nemi, worshiping Diana and Dianus, are indeed a religion. Now, those religious practices would have included rituals, sermons, commemoration, veneration of deities, sacrifices, trances, initiations, matrimonial and funerary services, or rites, meditation, prayer, music, art, dance, and even in some cases public service. Initiates or members of that religious community would have included people of all occupations and statuses in a community, including bankers and teachers and shopkeepers and mothers and tax collectors and retired folk and healers. And put a pin in that for a moment. And those who lived on the fringes of society who were considered mystics or poisoners or hexers or visionaries. I use the analogy of, which many of you have heard before, of walking into a Roman Catholic church. If you've never been to a Roman Catholic church, just before Mass, and you meet a monk or a nun. Now, just because there are a few monks or nuns in the church doesn't mean everyone who is Catholic is a monk or a nun. And so there are also people at that mass who are bakers and bankers and teachers and shopkeepers and mothers and tax collectors and healers and so on. And so it is that the Reconstructionist ideas of pagan communities dedicated to the goddess and god are patently wrong to pretend that these are gatherings of witches, just because there may or may not have been magical practitioners among the devotees of Diana and Dianus who gathered there. That's a lie that was promulgated by the Roman Catholic and later Anglican churches. Now, if we fast forward to the early 20th century, people like Margaret Murray and Charles Leland would promulgate now discredited claims that those religious gatherings, some of which I know firsthand continue to exist to this day, were gatherings of Italian witches. That, again, is bullshit. But it led to some 20 to 25 years later, questionable characters like Gerald Gardner creating a new religion which attempted to reconstruct pagan religions and merge it with imaginary accounts of Italian witchcraft, which neither he nor Leland would ever have had access to because we don't share our tradition with outsiders until the present day, when some of us, who, including these folks who are making videos, feel that it's time to be more open. Some amazing people like Mary Grace Farron and Dee Norman and Frankie Castaneda, who say, I'm going to share my spirituality with you, and we'll get back to that in a few minutes. And so because of this conflation, because of this, the mythology that Leland created and that Margaret Murray promulgated in her book about the witch cults of Europe, the pop culture witches we now see in Wicca, Alexandrian magic, even really disgraceful traditions like Stregoneria came to exist. Now, none of these have anything to do with or share any common origins with Italian folk magic, which, by the way, would have looked nothing like Southern Italian and Afro-Sicilian folk magic in any way, since the Etruscan influences were not the same influences that we find in the south region of what is now referred to as Italy. And remember, Italy didn't exist as a country until the 20th century. So that leads us to unpack the next element of this conversation, which is, what is folk magic then? Well, in short, folk magic is an extension of or organic development that came from ancient animism. It's a worldview, not a religion, that develops in the face of oppression, that develops in the face of suffering, calamity, or necessity, which employs the use of charms and spells, working with spiritual allies among the plant realm or ancestral realm, and so forth, to manipulate the energy around a person, a place, a situation, or condition, and shift it to conform to our intended outcome. Now, in the case of Afro-Sicilian folk magic practices, we would have to note that, like all folk magic, it evolved over time, once responding to the threats of volcanic eruption, maybe years later referring to or responding to threats of oppression by various invaders and oppressors. And that is where things get messy but interesting. But make no mistake, places like Sicilia were not isolated from Italy, as some have suggested. That's nonsense. That's just historically bizarre that somebody would make that claim. And the southern part of Italy was once part of the two kingdoms of Sicily. So because of all of this, the Afro-Sicilian and Southern Italian folk magic, which existed as a secular worldview, as I said, and a cultural form of animism and esotericism, would intersect with Catholic folk magic in their particular regions as a response to the growing oppression. Say, for example, a great example of this would be the 4th century of the Common Era, in which the Roman Catholic Church played an egregious role oppressing women. So in the 5th century of the Common Era, the yeah, the 5th century, not the 4th century, Roman Catholicism suddenly banned the mitred abbesses and nuns who were presiding at the Catholic Eucharist, serving in the same role as the priests for almost 500 years. Pope Gelasius issued an edict in 495 in the Common Era, stripping the abbesses of their right to consecrate the Eucharist in their monasteries and convents. And until then, women held the priesthood throughout the Catholic Church. And that's a fact. Otherwise, why would he have had to issue an edict that said women can no longer celebrate the Eucharist? And so there are continuing groups of small communities that exist to this present day, whom the church would try to paint as malandanti, for example, by comparison to the imaginary benedanti, who were the good witches or the good magical practitioners. They would brand these women who continued to celebrate Mass and consecrate Eucharist and refused to accept Gelasius's vile edict, and these attempts to malign these women would give rise to tales about witches. The maligned abbesses and nuns included dancing in concert with an imaginary devil in groups of 11 plus the devil around the great tree of Benevento and so forth. Now, elsewhere, the church would ban things that were part of the cultural traditions of the Southern Italian and Afro-Sicilian people. So we would take those practices underground. Examples of this exist to this very day, like burying St. Joseph when you try to sell a home, or asking St. Anthony to find your lost keys. These are Catholic folk magic practices, not Italian folk magic practices. And they are particularly Catholic American folk magic practices that exist in various cultures in various forms. Now, another patently false claim is that somehow Catholic folk practitioners rejected the Roman Church or no longer feel that they needed to go to their God or Rabbi Jesus in prayer. This was a nonsensical construct that was promoted in second wave feminism around the neo-pagan and New Age ideology. But again, it's baseless. It demonstrates an ignorance of anthropology, history, and fact, and is influenced by 20th century bullshit stories told by neo-pagan and New Age organizations over the past 50 years. Santa Maria, or the Blessed Mother as she's known, has an exalted role in Catholic folk magic, yes, because she is seen as the co-redeemer, the mediatrix, and the first tabernacle, the sacred chalice from which her son was brought into this world, and without whom that wouldn't have happened. Not because people didn't like God anymore. Now, I'll say here that my explanation doesn't just come from my doctoral studies in theological anthropology or from my practice for the last 54 years of both Catholic folk magic and Afro-Sicilian folk magic, but I'm speaking as clergy and bishop of an Eastern Catholic Church who has long been branded as a heretic for my practices of magic and witchcraft, rejection of the institution's imaginary authority, its misogyny, its homophobia, the patriarchal evils that the church has perpetrated over centuries. And coming out as genderqueer and openly, actively gay after being sexually assaulted by 4 men in 1983 on May 10th in South Florida did have an impact on my worldview. It did expand my worldview to include elements of Central American folk magic and later African diasporic traditions. So my point is that we can't study folk magic in a vacuum. See, we're all living beings who are influenced by the world around us, and folk magic arises out of necessity, including the Afro-Sicilian and Southern Italian diaspora. The folk magic practiced by most Italian Americans or Sicilian Americans doesn't remotely look like the practices of their grandparents or great-grandparents or even their parents, because magic changes as we change, and we are the magic. That's why. So for those who suffer post-religious trauma, for example, why would you go to a church to get holy water when you can make it yourself? Or adopt my approach and stop the insanity and superstition in holy water and recognize that all water is sacred and doesn't require our intervention to become so. If you're using holy water, that's a Catholic folk magic practice, not an Italian folk magic practice. Likewise, if you're an Afro-Sicilian or Southern Italian and you're dressing the altar of your Catholic folk shrine to Mary with sprigs of rue, then you're incorporating Italian folk magic into your Catholic folk magic. And that's not only fine, it's freaking beautiful. And that's what led me to make this video. See, if you're not a scholar, stop fronting like you're a scholar. Stop fronting like you know the history of Italian or Afro-Sicilian folk magic because you read a few papers online. Because first of all, I'm pretty protective of and genuinely care about you. And that means all three of these people whose videos I responded to, because if I didn't care, I wouldn't have responded. I know you're making yourself look foolish in the eyes of many actual Italians, scholars, and academics, and actual practitioners, and it's unnecessary because your practice is perfectly authentic as it is. It is beautiful as it is, period. No questions about it. If you're not first or second generation Italian and you weren't taught by your family how you practiced, get the books written by Mary Grace Farren or Dee Norman on Italian folk magic, or get my books on Italian and Afro-Sicilian folk magic, and then create your own. None of us who've written books on the topic want you to adopt a codified practice because a codified practice doesn't exist. That's not how worldviews work. And by all means, teach it if you feel led to do that. That is a sacred vocation. It's also beautiful. But stop pretending that it has roots in ancient Italy because it doesn't. It's your practice. So own it. Be proud of that. Likewise, if you weren't raised Catholic or didn't convert to Catholicism, or you don't have a degree in Catholic theology, you likely have absolutely no idea what you're talking about when it comes to Catholic folk magic or Catholic conjure. So stop pretending that you know what you're talking about. Stop pretending to be an authority. Stop conflating it with Italian folk magic and your pagan views, because you're only making yourself look foolish. However, that doesn't mean that you can't adopt Catholic folk magic practices. You know, if you want to see a beautiful example of that, my friend Voga has adopted practices into their spiritual path that derive from Catholic folk magic, and they were never Catholic. My friend Frankie does the same thing. You know, builds a beautiful practice around Catholic folk magic practices, and they're not Catholic. But recognize that you're doing that. You're an outsider who is culturally borrowing from something that's not yours to create something new. I can't think of anything that's more beautiful or powerful than that. But it becomes cultural appropriation when you pretend to understand the origins and the actual Catholic folk magic practices as they've existed for centuries. Because you're culturally appropriating. Same thing when you think about it, the people who are neo-pagans are culturally appropriating from Romans or Greeks or Etruscans because they don't recognize that they've created something new. They hate the term neo-pagan because it lets people know that this is a 20th century adaptation of paganism. They would rather call themselves pagans and pretend that they had origins in the ancient world when their practice looks nothing like the ancient world, because the ancient world didn't merge religion and witchcraft. So trust me, you can still have a monetized channel on YouTube or Instagram or TikTok without fronting, without having to be pretending to be something you're not. Now, while I've pointed out some of the misstatements and false claims made in a few recent videos, and I roll my eyes when other academics who know better fail to correct those folks in academic discussion, that should never mean that I don't love and respect those practitioners, because they are putting themselves out there. They are sharing what they do. And that takes courage, that takes compassion, and that takes power. So I hope that this helps people to understand a little bit better where I'm coming from. I don't ask anyone to accept anything that I say at anything other than face value. You could do the research. It's the facts are out there. The history is out there. You just have to know where to look for credible sources. And to those practitioners whom I've corrected, if I offended you, I am genuinely sorry. You know, I recognize that being a neurodivergent, genderqueer activist can often make me come across as abrasive, and that some of your followers may not like the fact that I point out some of the inaccuracies in your video. Doesn't mean I don't love you. Doesn't mean if I didn't love you, if I didn't respect you, I wouldn't bother looking at your videos, and I certainly wouldn't bother wasting my time and energy commenting.